August 1943, the first train carrying German prisoners rolled into the heart of America. The steel wheels groaned against the rails, each clatter echoing across the quiet fields of rural Texas. Sunlight bounced off the corrugated metal of the boxcars, catching on the barbed wire that crowned them. Inside, the men sat in silence, their uniforms worn and stained, their eyes hollow from months of conflict, surrender, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. They had been soldiers, killers, and victims of a war that stretched across continents. Now, they were captives, transported thousands of miles from the beaches, cities, and forests they had once roamed. Outside, the landscape was alien to them. Rolling hills stretched under a sky so wide and endless that it seemed to mock the cramped confines of the boxcars. Trees with leaves unlike those of Europe swayed in a gentle wind, and the distant sound of a train whistle blended with the hum of insects and the chirping of birds, a symphony of life untouched by war. Some men pressed their faces to the narrow slats, trying to glimpse the world outside, to understand the country that had captured them. The rail yards were bustling with activity, American soldiers in crisp uniforms moving with efficiency and precision that struck the Germans as almost mechanical. Every motion was deliberate, every action purposeful, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind on European battlefields. The prisoners had traveled through months of uncertainty, interrogations in makeshift camps, long journeys by ship across the Atlantic with rolling waves and unrelenting seasickness, and the endless question of what America was really like. They had heard stories from captured comrades, that it was a land of overwhelming abundance, of machines and factories producing goods in unimaginable quantities, a country so powerful that it seemed almost unreal. Now, they were about to see it with their own eyes. And even the hardest among them, the seasoned soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front, the deserts of Africa, and the skies over Britain, felt a ripple of disbelief as they stepped off the train and into the blazing Texan sun. The camp itself was meticulously organized. Wooden barracks lined the grounds, their paint bright and freshly applied. Watchtowers loomed over the perimeters, but the soldiers manning them moved with a calm, measured authority rather than the tension the Germans had expected. Gates opened smoothly, guards spoke in clipped English that was polite yet firm, and the air smelled of earth, timber, and something else, prosperity, in its quiet, understated form. The Germans had been prepared for hardship, hunger, and intimidation, but instead they found order, cleanliness, and a strange kind of comfort. Food was plentiful, rationed in a way that seemed generous to men who had known starvation. Beds were neatly made, blankets clean, and water flowed freely from taps that had been installed with care. It was a world that felt almost absurd to those who had been hardened by siege and bombardment. Even the machines fascinated them. Trucks rumbled along the camp's dirt roads with a low, steady growl, carrying supplies with precision that suggested a system beyond anything the Germans had seen at the front. Cranes lifted heavy shipments effortlessly, and the distant hum of factories could be heard from miles away, a constant reminder of American productivity. For men who had seen cities reduced to rubble, whose countries were burned, bombed, and stripped bare, the sheer scale of America's industrial capacity was a revelation. They had fought against tanks, artillery, and aircraft, but nothing had prepared them for this quiet, inexhaustible power, a nation building, producing, and sustaining while the world burned. In the evenings, the prisoners gathered along the edges of the camp, talking in low voices about the contradictions they witnessed. Some marveled at the abundance, stacks of canned goods, neatly arranged barracks, and workshops filled with gleaming tools and machinery. Others whispered about the strange optimism in the American soldiers' faces, the way they moved with purpose without seeming rushed or anxious. It was a stark contrast to the faces they had known back home, gaunt, hardened, marked by endless war, suspicion, and fear. Here, there was a sense of confidence that went beyond military discipline. It was a quiet certainty that this country could endure, could outlast, could rebuild, and could triumph. As days passed, the Germans began to glimpse the scale of the industry that sustained this country. Trucks and trains moved constantly, carrying raw materials to factories where workers assembled them into weapons, vehicles, and machinery with a speed and precision that defied belief. Factories pulsed with activity day and night, the air thick with the scent of metal, oil, and smoke. Machines operated in concert, synchronized like the movements of a military unit, each cog and lever part of an immense, humming organism. The prisoners could not hide their awe. Some pressed their faces to the windows of the barracks to watch the assembly lines, tracing the motions of men and machines with a mixture of envy and disbelief. This was not a land stretched thin by war. This was a nation at its peak, harnessing every ounce of energy, skill, and ingenuity to turn raw materials into unstoppable force. Letters and stories had hinted at this, but nothing compared to seeing it firsthand. The Germans whispered among themselves about the efficiency, the size of the operations, and the sheer number of men and machines devoted to producing war material. They had fought against tanks and airplanes in Europe, but these were mere fragments of what America could produce daily. Entire factories were capable of replacing what the enemy destroyed, often in multiples. The prisoners, who had been trained to see the world in terms of scarcity and rationing, found themselves confronted by abundance so vast that it almost seemed unreal. Some tried to reconcile their experiences with the propaganda they had grown up with. The Reich had taught them that America was decadent, weak, and morally corrupt, a nation incapable of sustaining a protracted conflict. Yet here was evidence to the contrary: order, purpose, industry, and an almost relentless optimism that defied the destruction of war. Each observation deepened their sense of shock and unease. They realized that this country was not just fighting, it was preparing to win, not merely in battle but in the capacity to outlast, outproduce, and ultimately outmaneuver any opponent. Yet, even amidst the awe, there were moments of fear, homesickness, and reflection. Prisoners wrote letters they knew would never reach home, describing the strangeness of a world so different from the one they had known. Some wandered the camp quietly, tracing their fingers over the smooth wood of a barack, the freshly cut grass underfoot, or the polished metal of a vehicle, remembering streets of shattered stone, rubble, and the acrid smell of smoke in European cities. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The Americans had built an environment that seemed to defy the destruction that had ravaged Europe. And the Germans understood, with a sinking certainty, that they were now pawns in a system far larger than themselves, a war that stretched beyond their comprehension and reach. By September 1943, the camp had settled into a rhythm that was alien to both captors and captives. The Germans awoke at dawn, performed roll call, worked in labor details, and returned to their barracks at night. The Americans moved among them with calm authority, correcting mistakes gently but firmly, enforcing rules without cruelty. In workshops, prisoners were sometimes allowed to help repair machinery or assist with logistics, exposing them even further to the industrial might they had once only glimpsed in rumor. Each day reinforced the impression that they were living in a world organized for endurance, resilience, and victory, a world designed to harness human and mechanical potential to its maximum. Some prisoners began to document what they saw, sketching machinery, noting the scale of production, and describing the layout of factories, rail yards, and warehouses. These notes, smuggled in whispers or hidden among personal belongings, would later become part of intelligence reports, giving the Germans a window into a nation whose capacity they had underestimated. The astonishment and fear grew side by side. They marveled at the ingenuity and efficiency while quietly realizing that their homeland had already lost a psychological battle. They had fought men and machines, but they had not fought a nation capable of sustaining and rebuilding faster than it could be destroyed. As the months passed, the first POWs who arrived in August began to influence the newcomers. They shared stories of the discipline and organization, the abundance of food and medical care, the constant movement of trains and trucks, and the scale of factories producing weapons, vehicles, and supplies in numbers beyond belief. Rumors of the American automobile plants turned into first-hand accounts, and the prisoners spoke of assembly lines running day and night, producing planes and tanks at a pace that made their heads spin. Each tale reinforced the sense of awe and helplessness, painting America not just as a battlefield opponent, but as an industrial colossus that would not be defeated by attrition alone. The shock of arrival, the alien efficiency, and the vastness of American industrial power left an indelible mark on every prisoner. They had been soldiers, conditioned to fight, survive, and obey. Yet in this foreign land, they confronted a force that was not merely military, but systemic, cultural, and economic, a power that reshaped their understanding of war and its true scale. They began to see that battles were fought not only with bullets and bombs but with planning, production, and the unyielding application of human ingenuity. By late 1943, The prisoners had been at the camp for several months, and the novelty of the surrounding fields and barracks had settled into a strange familiarity. Yet, the awe never diminished when they were escorted beyond the immediate perimeter. On certain days, groups of POWs were taken under supervision to nearby industrial sites, places that seemed to exist on an entirely different plane of human achievement. Rail yards buzzed with activity as long trains, loaded with steel and machinery, glided effortlessly along tracks that stretched into the horizon. Cranes swung with precision, lifting tons of cargo with minimal human effort, and the prisoners watched, often speechless, as trucks loaded with munitions and raw materials departed for unknown destinations, never pausing, never faltering. Inside the factories, the prisoners were struck by the sheer scale of production. Assembly lines stretched as far as the eye could see, men and machines working in perfect harmony. Conveyors carried components that would become tanks, planes, or artillery pieces, moving at a speed that left the German soldiers dizzy. Each worker had a rhythm, each machine a purpose, and together they created an orchestrated symphony of production that no European city, scarred by war, could match. The Germans noted the ease with which the Americans coordinated these operations: no shouting, no visible confusion, only relentless, precise motion. It was not just the quantity of production that astonished them, it was the quality. Every vehicle, every piece of equipment, gleamed under the industrial lighting. Paint was fresh, metal polished, and each part seemed to fit perfectly into the next. For soldiers who had witnessed European factories bombed into ruins, where machinery was scavenged and repaired by hand, the contrast was staggering. Here, America had built a system so efficient that it seemed to defy the logic of war itself. Even more remarkable were the technological innovations. Machines that cut, welded, and assembled automatically moved with a fluidity that the Germans had never seen. Robots, in the primitive sense, worked alongside humans, performing repetitive or dangerous tasks with consistent accuracy. The prisoners could hardly comprehend the scale: acres of machinery, thousands of workers, all producing at a pace that made the German industrial experience seem primitive. Conversations between POWs reflected a growing realization: this was not just a country at war, this was a nation whose very identity was intertwined with production, efficiency, and progress. Some of the prisoners were assigned to labor details within these factories. At first, the tasks were simple: moving materials, observing assembly lines, or performing minor maintenance under strict supervision. Yet even in these small roles, the Germans could see the immense coordination required to keep the operation running. Supervisors communicated through gestures and concise words, and machinery continued its relentless pace, seemingly unbound by fatigue or distraction. One soldier, formerly an engineer in the Luftwaffe, walked the length of an aircraft assembly line and marveled at the precision. "They make it look effortless," he whispered to a fellow prisoner. "Every part, every bolt, all of it moves as if by magic." Outside the factories, the POWs saw the transportation network that connected these hubs of production. Highways, rail lines, and trucks formed a seamless web, ensuring that no product, no matter how heavy or complex, was delayed. Soldiers who had traveled across bombed-out European roads, dodging craters and shellfire, were astonished at the smooth, straight avenues cutting through the American landscape, carrying ton after ton of industrial output with ease. It was a scale of organization, a rhythm of movement, that no European command could have imagined. Even recreation was structured, though it did not escape notice. Camps were equipped with athletic fields, theaters, and libraries. Soldiers noticed that even in leisure, the Americans seemed disciplined, coordinated, and orderly. Every detail was accounted for, from the cleanliness of the facilities to the punctuality of events. The prisoners, some hardened by the trenches and battlefields of Europe, found themselves quietly envious. It was as if every aspect of this society, from work to leisure, was part of the same machine, each component reinforcing the other. As the months rolled on, the prisoners began to talk about what they were seeing in more personal terms. Some wrote in diaries or exchanged letters they never expected to be sent, describing the awe and disbelief. They compared notes on factory efficiency, the abundance of food, the precision of American logistics, and the discipline of soldiers who managed these operations. It became a quiet obsession among them, understanding how a nation, so far removed from the horrors they had endured, could marshal such power and maintain it in the midst of a global conflict. It was during these months that subtle psychological changes became apparent. Some POWs, once brash or defiant, grew contemplative, often staring at assembly lines or rail yards for hours, lost in thought. Others, more practical, began attempting to reconcile the reality before them with the propaganda they had been fed. Tales of American weakness or decadence fell apart in the face of men and machines operating in perfect coordination. The industrial might of this country was not just a rumor, not just an exaggeration, it was a fact, undeniable and overwhelming. The astonishment often turned into quiet discussion about the implications for the war. Soldiers who had once believed that Germany could outmaneuver or outfight the Allies now confronted a sobering reality. They were up against a nation that could replace losses faster than they could inflict them, that could build new planes, tanks, and ships in quantities previously unimaginable. Factories did not tire, assembly lines did not sleep, and transportation networks ensured that production reached the front lines without delay. It was a relentless, unstoppable force, and for men who had fought across continents, the realization was profound. By early 1944, the camp had become a window into this world. German POWs watched as trains delivered raw materials from distant states, factories transformed them into instruments of war, and shipments departed again toward ports and fronts. Each movement reinforced a single truth: America was not only participating in the war, it was reshaping it. The prisoners began to speak in hushed tones about the scale of what they had witnessed, the efficiency that dwarfed even the best-planned German operations. They marveled at how smoothly everything functioned, how human labor and mechanical precision blended seamlessly, and how a nation of millions could maintain such a system under wartime pressures. Some prisoners were allowed to work directly in production, under careful supervision, and it was there that their understanding deepened. They touched metal, operated machinery, and witnessed the constant output of aircraft, vehicles, and munitions. Each task, while simple, was part of a massive, interconnected system. They began to understand how a country could endure, adapt, and expand even while fighting a war on multiple fronts. They wrote observations, whispered analyses, and sometimes sketched diagrams of machinery and workflow. These small acts of documentation became exercises in comprehension, attempts to grasp a scale of industrial capability previously inconceivable. Even the natural landscape of America seemed to contribute to this industrial might. Fields stretched unbroken, rivers ran wide and navigable, forests provided timber for construction, and mineral-rich lands offered resources that Europe could not easily match. The POWs understood that they were witnessing more than machines. They were observing a nation whose geography, population, and culture combined to create a force of production that would be impossible to halt. It was a silent lesson in power, one that left an impression far more enduring than any battlefield encounter. And yet, even amidst this awe, there was a quiet human drama unfolding. Prisoners struggled with homesickness, loneliness, and the uncertainty of the future. Some questioned their previous beliefs, some wondered about survival, and others simply tried to reconcile the strange mixture of captivity and comfort. For all the machinery, abundance, and order, there was still the human cost of war, the absence of family, the memories of comrades lost, the longing for a world that no longer existed. America's industrial might, vast as it was, could not erase those personal scars. By the winter of 1944, the bitter winds of December swept across the plains of Texas, carrying with them a quiet that contrasted sharply with the clatter of the railways and the distant rumble of industry. The first German prisoners, once young soldiers of the Wehrmacht, had spent more than a year in the heart of America, and now the realities of their captivity had crystallized into something deeper than fear or resentment. They had arrived with suspicion, eyes wary of every smile, every handshake, and every polite gesture from the Americans around them. But over time, even the most hardened had begun to notice the rhythm of this new world, a rhythm powered not by ideology, nor by conquest, but by sheer, unrelenting productivity. In the warehouses and factories where men and women labored side by side, the POWs witnessed machinery that roared like living beasts, belts spinning endlessly, stamping steel, forging engines, and assembling trucks that would carry the war thousands of miles from home. German eyes, trained to measure efficiency by military precision, were humbled by the scale of America's industrial might. The factories were vast, sprawling complexes where no detail seemed too small, where every bolt, every wheel, every rivet was part of a larger design, a design that operated with a discipline and speed that the European powers could scarcely imagine. They had fought against tanks, artillery, and planes, yet here, in the heart of a nation untouched by the front lines, they faced an opponent they could not fire upon, could not bomb, and could not simply outmaneuver. It was the invisible army of production, and it was inexhaustible. At first, the POWs had approached the assembly lines with a mix of awe and disbelief, wondering how a nation of civilians could maintain such relentless output without the coercion of war propaganda or fear of punishment. Yet, as weeks turned into months, they began to see patterns, a kind of quiet discipline embedded in every gesture and motion. Men and women moved with practiced efficiency, speaking little, yet communicating everything through gestures, eyes, and the unbroken cadence of labor. They carried the weight of the war not in rifles or uniforms, but in sweat, precision, and the hum of machinery that refused to stop. Some prisoners, having once trained in the factories of Berlin or Munich, could not help but compare the scenes, and every comparison left them in awe. America's factories were not just large, they were alive, synchronized, and unstoppable. They operated with a confidence that came not from fear, but from knowledge that what they built would reach the men at the front, sustain them, and tip the balance of battles yet to come. In the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the distant oil rigs and the horizon blazed with the fading warmth of day, the POWs often gathered in small groups near the barracks, sharing stories of their former lives in Europe. Many had once believed their armies were invincible, their technology superior, their nation destined for glory. But here, in the heart of America, they began to understand a truth that could not be denied: their homeland had been outmatched not by strategy alone, but by the raw scale of industrial output, the speed of assembly lines, and the untiring will of a civilian workforce mobilized for victory. Trucks rolled off the lines in numbers they had never seen, tanks were shipped to ports in quantities unimaginable, and planes rose daily into the sky with the steady rhythm of a nation on a mission. To the POWs, it was both humbling and terrifying. They were captives of a power so vast that it dwarfed any battlefield they had ever known. Some of the prisoners were assigned to work alongside the Americans, clearing debris, helping with construction, or assisting in small mechanical tasks under careful supervision. At first, there was tension, the silent distance of men trained to distrust the unfamiliar. But over time, shared labor forged unexpected bonds. The Americans did not speak to them with derision or contempt, but with patience, explanation, and sometimes quiet humor. They saw the POWs not as enemies, but as human beings caught in the machinery of a war they did not control. Small gestures, a shared meal, a tip of a hat, a nod of respect when a particularly difficult task was completed, began to break down barriers, and even the most cynical prisoners began to see glimpses of an unfamiliar world, a world where work, discipline, and respect created results far beyond the limits of any soldier's skill. In the months that followed, the POWs traveled to cities and industrial centers under guard, their eyes widening at the scale of operations. Steel mills that could produce hundreds of tons a day, rail yards with locomotives arriving and departing like clockwork, aircraft factories churning out fighters and bombers by the dozen, all of it left them breathless. They began to write letters to families back in Germany, describing not just the strictness of their confinement, but the almost miraculous capabilities of a nation that had turned factories into engines of war, mobilizing men, women, and machines in a way that made previous notions of power seem quaint. Some letters were never sent, censored by American authorities, but the words lingered, etched in the prisoners' minds: they are not just building weapons, they are building the future, and it moves faster than we ever imagined. By mid-1945, as the war in Europe drew to a close and the Nazi regime collapsed, the POWs understood that their captivity had offered them a lens through which to see a different kind of victory. They had witnessed firsthand the tools of triumph not carried by generals or tanks alone, but by ordinary people armed with ingenuity, resilience, and a vision of coordinated effort. The stories they would carry home were not tales of defeat alone, but of admiration, a recognition that the industrial might they had underestimated had played a decisive role in shaping history. When the time finally came for repatriation, the trains rolled once more, now carrying men who had endured captivity, hard labor, and the humbling realization of a foe unlike any they had fought on the front lines. They looked out the windows at fields and towns that had become familiar, and yet they knew they were leaving with more than memories of confinement. They carried with them a deep, unspoken understanding of what it meant to harness the power of an entire nation toward a single purpose, and how that power could tilt the scales of history in ways soldiers and generals alone could not achieve. In the quiet moments before they boarded ships bound for Germany, many of the men paused to reflect. They had arrived with fear, skepticism, and defiance. They were leaving with respect, wonder, and a measure of humility. The factories, the railways, the assembly lines, the endless rivers of steel and oil, all of it had left an indelible mark. The German soldiers, once trained to see the world through the lens of conquest and discipline, now understood a different kind of strength, one built on perseverance, innovation, and the unyielding will of a people who refused to stop, no matter the cost. As the ship departed the American coastline, the POWs gazed back at the vast expanse of land that had held them captive, and yet, in its own way, had liberated a perspective they would never forget. They had been prisoners of war, but they had also been witnesses to a power that transcended borders and armies, a power born not from fear, but from purpose, unity, and an unwavering commitment to achieving what others deemed impossible. In their silence, in their shared glances, and in the letters they would carry home, the story of America's industrial might had been etched into memory, a lesson as vivid and enduring as any battle they had fought. And as the horizon swallowed the last glimpse of the Texas plains, each man knew, with quiet certainty, that history had shifted before their eyes, and they had been unwilling participants in its unfolding.